All right, our final lecture. I cannot express in words how much I have loved this class. If you have loved it even a fraction of what I have, you will have gotten so much out of it. And again, I reiterate, as much as I am privileged and blessed to be able to share my thoughts and have you listen about these wonderful, wonderful texts, I feel even more blessed to be able to read your thoughts on them and engage with them as I comment on your papers. I wish we could be having these discussions in person, but I'm happy to have as a close second discussing them online through comments and lectures. So thank you for being a part of this class with me. I'm truly grateful for you. Real quick note before we look at our last text here, I've listed two readings. This one, MHohner's The Old Gun, and then Jamaica Kincaid's Girl. Jamaica Kincaid's Girl is just one page, one sentence, and it's essentially a statement from a mother to a daughter giving her advice on how to be a woman. And it seems harsh, but there's some really interesting ideas in there, and I think they illustrate, what things were like for women in colonial Antigua, which is part of the Caribbean or the West Indies, which is an important part of the world we haven't studied enough. And I started to prepare a lecture on it, and then I stopped. One issue I have with teaching online, as much as I love teaching online, is there's less room. Although with the threads and thesis and the papers, I've tried to create as much room as I can for you to contribute your own ideas to the discussions. But as I was starting to prepare a lecture on Jamaica Kincaid's Girl, I stepped back and I said, I want to give them as much room as I can in this online setting for their own ideas. So I want you to do what you can, what you want with that one page, one sentence story. You can do either it or The Old Gun for your thread thesis assignment. You can do it or The Old Gun for the quiz. You can choose. And I'm going to read every word of those. And when I read them, I'd love to hear what you think of Jamaica Kincaid's Girl. As wonderful as that text is, MHohner's The Old Gun obviously is a little bit more dense. It's certainly about 10 pages longer in what are very long pages. So I'm going to try to unpack it in this lecture, and it's hard to choose a final text for this class. I want to go chronologically. If I'm going to pick my favorite, it's going to be either Course Simple or Notes from Underground, as you probably could have guessed, as much as I love every one of these texts on which I've presented to you. And so I can't end with my favorite because I want to go chronologically, but I'm going to, with this lecture, try to return as much as possible to the guiding ideas that I have intended to guide us the whole way through so that we end on a cohesive note, as we've covered a lot of different things. So a little bit about Yan. He burst onto China's literary scene with his first novel, I believe, Red Sorghum in 1986. And then a movie, a famous Chinese director caught on to it, and just a year later made a film in 1987, which was also a commercial and critical success. And so he became famous like right away, basically, when he was only 30 years old. And when he's gone on to write a number of novels and short stories, and won the Nobel Prize in 2012, and most of those have been translated by his collaborator into numerous languages, obviously including English. Much of his fiction is set in Shandong County, which is interesting. If you remember in lecture 4, that particular area, I thought it was a province, not a county, but the textbook here said county, was fought over between China and Japan for a long time. It was part of China as the Japanese Empire was expanding. They tried to colonize. And student protests, if you remember from lecture 4, actually forced Chinese leaders not to sign a particular part of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I, because that part of the treaty would have given control of Shandong County to Japan. And we heard that in the lecture on Liu Zhen's Diary of a Madman. And so the Chinese context is incredibly important here. And so we'll kind of revisit some of those themes we saw in Diary of a Madman as we go through this lecture. But I find it fascinating that this is where Yan is from and where much of his fiction, including Red Sorghum, takes place. And so I've never read Red Sorghum, but now I would really like to, because I love history or fiction that has that kind of historical element to it. So what else do we learn about a man who is really not been around that long, 35 years in terms of being on the literary scene. Well, he was part of a literary movement called the Roots-Seeking Movement, which took hold in China in the 1980s. And this story is very much emblematic of that movement. So it's a good thing we're studying it. There's big literary movements like Romanticism, Realism, Modernism, but then there are little ones that happen all throughout the world. So I'm glad we're studying kind of a smaller one here. What can we learn about this movement? It was a response to the swift modernization of China. So we've talked about the Industrial Revolution and some of the progress that the 19th century and 20th century bore throughout the world, especially in Europe and the U.S. China was not as quick to modernize as those other parts of the world. But when Mao, who we've talked about quite a bit, came to power, China he forced China to modernize incredibly rapidly. And so modernizing that fast caused all kinds of problems. And at this point in the 80s, Mao has passed and the communist state is in decline. And eventually in the 90s and the 2000s, China will move to a capitalist state. So Yan is writing and his contemporaries are writing kind of a period of decline of the previous state. And they're looking back and saying, we modernized very fast. How do we respond to that? Well, during the period of high modernization in China, a lot of the texts that came out supported communism, and they were optimistic narratives of revolutionary progress. But just like the state of the country, those kinds of narratives and works being popular had started to decline and disappear. So there was really kind of a moment for Yan and his contemporaries to seize the day and offer a different kind of narrative. What would that narrative be? Well, it was a narrative that encapsulates anxieties over China's eroding cultural identity and continuing economic and technological lag behind the West. So we see now that China has really caught up. But at that time, even with Mao's swift modernization, they were still behind. So there was anxiety over that. But then also, as I said, the state was in decline. So China needed a new identity. Identity was no longer Mao's China. They needed a new identity. What could that identity be? Well, most writers of the movement were young men who sought to turn from grand models of the future, which are those kind of optimistic pro-communist texts, to instead look for Chinese selfhood in intimate, local, and rooted places around them, the rural past, family lives, and small H history. So they believe by turning to the rural past, looking at family lines, ancestry, and the history of those particular family lines and ancestries rather than the grand history of the entire country would give China the new cultural identity it needed to emerge once again as a powerful state. And so I think we see some commonalities here with Latin American, Native American literature, connection to the past, to the legends of the family history. And so I think that's a theme that really predominates this last unit. And if we're going to try to tie together Module 6, I would argue that what we see is we've moved far enough past the rise of modernity, almost 100 years from when automobiles and biological warfare were invented, to a point now where we can look back and say, what has all this modernization done? And you see writers in disparate parts of the world, Latin America, North America, Asia, saying, let's look to the past. Let's look to the rural roots and kind of bring back some of the ideas from before and have more of a hybridity of past and present rather than a swift march into modernity. And so I think the themes of the class come full circle in this text. One thing to note, though, before we dive into it, is the focus of young men in this movement. So this movement, the Roots-Seeking movement in China, has been critiqued by feminists as being like hyper-masculine. I don't think the feminists are saying there's something wrong with being masculine, but being masculine to the point that it essentially erodes the female position in the work. Females have an inferior role in these works, is the argument. And I think I should look into how Yan has responded to that. I think he he's not really responded to it, I think, is my recollection. But that's a question I think we should have, is what is the position, the role of the female characters here, and is it diminished to the degree that the critics of Yan argue that it is? And that's another reason why I paired this text with Jamaica Kincaid's Girl to end the course, is because that way you have, a text that really focuses on the male perspective with one that focuses pretty much entirely on the female perspective. And what I'd like to hope for, maybe we can find through the discussion board or the papers, is kind of a unification, a bringing together, a synthesis of those two perspectives. Perhaps they should not be at odds. But let's take a look at the story, which is incredibly complex. So some threads. The textbook says that Yan uses free indirect discourse, which is a literary technique from the 19th century, to provide psychological insight to the main character. So looking at a character psychology has long been one of the most important aspects of great literature. And in the 19th century, you would have sprawling novels by writers like Dostoevsky that would spend pages outlining what was going inside a character's mind. And then in the early 20th century, you had writers like Joyce and Woolf, and later Garcia Marquez, who would start talking, go from first-person narration to a narrative voice where you were inside the character's head and literally hearing their thoughts, rather than having a third-person narrator describe their thoughts. And we call that kind of jarring approach to its stream of consciousness. But in between those two, something emerged that I would argue essentially Flaubert invented, called free indirect discourse, which we see in Un Cours Simple, where rather than spending pages with a third-person objective narrator describing what a character's thinking, it's indirect and it's free. So through the events of the story, which as you can see in Un Cours Simple, Flaubert doesn't tell us what's going on in Felicity's head. He shows us rather than tells us through the events, and we're able to infer it. And it leads to a very quick, succinct, I think more enjoyable prose. And that's why it's so fun to read Flaubert. Now, I quibble with the textbook here a little bit because I don't quite think what Yan is doing is free indirect discourse. It's not quite stream of consciousness because we don't dive in as deep as we do with stream of consciousness, and it's not as jarring of a transition, although it has a little bit of that. And it's certainly not what the realists, the high realists like Dostoevsky would do, because it's more succinct than that. But I would argue it's not as succinct and as beautiful as what Flaubert does. It's kind of in between all of those, kind of a hodgepodge of those. But nonetheless, we have great, deep insight to the psychology of the main character, and that's a very important part of this story. Certainly the masculine power of the gun. It's a little obvious, rather very obvious, but it still needs to be stated. And then the gun is also called a snake, twice. So what does that mean? I'm wondering. There's a narrative structure here which is really important to unpack. So you go from the main narrative to the flashback, essentially in 6 parts of the story. Main narrative, flashback to when he's a boy. Main narrative, flashback to when his father dies. Main narrative, flashback to when his grandfather dies. And finally, the conclusion of the story in the main narrative. So really 7 parts, I meant to say. But one thing, so it follows a pattern. And then one thing to note is as we go to the flashbacks, we go further back in time. So that seems important. Yan is reaching into the past here as we work to understand the psychology of the main character. That's very important. The pressure to succeed in Chinese culture, which is a huge amount of pressure typically placed on young people. So that's something kind of unique to the culture that we do see show up here. The innate desire to kill something. This boy just wants to kill something. I think that's a part of the story we can't overlook. What is that impulse and where does it come from? I don't know. Is it uniquely masculine? I don't know that either. It's not an impulse I've ever had, but I don't think it's one we can outright dismiss either. I have friends, for instance, I have a friend who just wanted to kill something. There's a thing you can do where you can buy an entire pig and store the meat in your freezer, to feed your family. And so one of my friends did that, but he actually got to go kill the pig as part of the process. And his wife said it just kind of satisfied his desire to kill something. And also, I mean, hunting is an incredibly popular sport, and that's essentially what this story is about. And one way of saying it is hunting. So why does Yan choose to address this desire of an innate desire to kill just something, kill anything? It's not a desire for murder. That's not the same thing. Although there's a great movie with John Cusack called Grosse Pointe Blank, where he becomes a hitman and leaves his girlfriend on prom night. And it's about 10 years later at his 10-year reunion trying to reconcile with that girlfriend because he said he just felt the desire to kill someone. And he's a very kind of anti-hero, sympathetic figure in that fascinating movie. And so, I don't think the text is by any means justifying violence or saying murder is a good thing, but it's dealing with this psychological desire that many people have and seeing how that plays out in this particular context. Finally, I think I really had trouble trying to fully understand this story, but the conclusion I came to gave me a good way to wrap up what will be our final lecture for the class. And so I think an idea at work here is an idea put forth by an author named Richard Slotkin called regeneration through violence. And so that's a lot to unpack. So table that, save that phrase. It's a catchy phrase in the back of your mind, regeneration through violence. And we'll explore and unpack what that means at the very end of the lecture. All right, close reading, last one. Thank you for being a part of all this time. So here's some of that psychological insight. When they, the ducks, descended onto the sandbar, their wings beating the air, he was beside himself with excitement. Never before had he come across so many wild ducks on such a small piece of land. Never. They still weren't there. By now they really should have been. They weren't here yet, or they weren't coming. So he's clearly frustrated here, and we're able to dive into his mind without the narrator telling us too much of what's actually going on in his mind. So like I said, it's kind of in between high realism and free and direct discourse. But what do we learn from the fact that he's very frustrated? The ducks haven't shown up. He's just so eager to kill something. Well, one of the main aspects of that root-seeking movement we discussed earlier is that the reforms of Mao in Mao's communist China led to what these writers like Yan felt was an emasculation of the men in the society. And so a lot of these stories try to reclaim masculinity. That you could say that's a central theme of these kinds of stories of this particular movement. And so the protagonist feels emasculated here. And there's also repression. He's never been able to have access to this gun. Now he does, but he can't do anything with it. So he's also experiencing repression, which, kind of goes along with the emasculation. And of course, how would, finally being able to use that gun, set him free from his repression? Well, there's a quite interesting passage of language that tells us some of that. The percussion cap contained yellow gunpowder. As soon as the hammer struck it, this would explode, igniting the power in the barrel and sending a fiery snake leaping into the muzzle, slender at first, until finally the gun looked like an iron broom. And so you have kind of something that's not quite magic realism, but it's kind of verging on it. I think what I've noticed Yan likes to do is take ideas from other writers like Flaubert's free and direct discourse or Garcia Marquez's magic realism and kind of tread on that territory now, but not going full into it. And so the gun doesn't literally become a snake here, but it's more than a metaphor, less than magic realism is how I'd put it. And that's important. Why is it a snake? I mean, a snake is certainly powerful, and it certainly could kind of move, in a shape that's not too different from a rifle because it's like a slender, long shape that moves. But it's not the first metaphor I would pick for a gun. And Yan doesn't have any issues with being blunt, being obvious, being hyperbolic. So I don't think he's restraining himself just for the sake of subtlety here. I think there's something very crucial about it being a snake. But what is that? One thing I risk in this lecture is mapping Western ideas or ones from Judeo-Christian traditions onto Chinese literature that's never been a part of that culture. But I just have to wonder, as much as I risk the danger of doing that, which we shouldn't do, is this perhaps an allusion to the snake from Genesis 3, because Yan was certainly well read, so certainly familiar with Judeo-Christian ideas, even if he didn't grow up in that culture. And so I just wonder if that's part of this here. And I'd love to hear, your thoughts on that. What could it mean? I mean, the snake is responsible in a way for the fall of leading people to what causes them to become fallen, for the fall of humankind. And so what's the statement about the gun here? Let's think about it. And then I didn't include the passage for the sake of time, but later on he calls the gun a snake again. And there's not a ton of repetition in this text, although there's some. So that seems really important, even though I haven't quite been able to pin down the meaning. Maybe you can help me with that. So I talked about the narrative structure and how it slips kind of in between his perspective and the flashbacks. What's really interesting is you have kind of a movement the first time it goes to a flashback where there's no context, no preamble that this is a flashback. If we haven't read any background and context and we're just jumping into this story with no prior knowledge, we would be a little bit jarred here. Now, he does the same thing with all three of the flashbacks, and each one is integrated a little more seamlessly. Here we at least have a paragraph break. But after this first one, once we realize we're in a flashback, we expect it to be coming. So this first one is a little bit more jarring than the others. So let's take a look at it. As he ran his hand over the trigger, he suddenly realized his great disadvantage. Recalling with a sense of pain his index finger, two of the joints were missing, the last one remained, a gnarled tree stump squatting between his thumb and his middle finger. He was only 6 years old when his mother came back from his father's funeral, dressed in mourning, a long cotton gown with a hempen cord tied around the waist, her hair flowing loose. So we get a ton of important stuff from this passage. I picked it because I wanted you to see the jarring nature of that transition and highlight that. But, that's all there really is to that specific point. But if we look at the other things here, a bunch of interesting things emerge. So the missing figure further represents emasculation, especially since his mother chopped it off. The transition without any segue shows the fluidity of past and present. Remember, this literary movement, the root-seeking movement, was all about reaching into the past and pulling it forward to bridge past and present to build a new Chinese identity. And we go farther back in the past, the farther we go in the story. So that's kind of a reaching movement. And so the slipping back and forth without any transition, any clear segue, any overt one, we have to infer it. It demands of us, of the reader. If I didn't know flashbacks were coming when I read this, I would have been more jarred. And so it shows that the past and the present are much fluid than we think they are. We haven't made a complete full break with the past, despite all of the progress, so to speak, of modernity. And then there's this interesting comment about the mother's clothing. Why describe her clothing? Hempen cord tied around her waist. As this story and feminist critics of Yan point out, women in Chinese culture for a long time, they were forced to have their feet bound. It caused deformity, but for whatever reason, horrible reason, people thought their feet should be small. And so that, comes to be very representative of the fact that women are not just physically constrained by their bodies, but constrained in this kind of communist culture where they don't have many options or much flexibility for what they can do. And so their bodies are physically bound, but all of their social movement is also bound. And even just a hempen cord around the waist can allude to that. And so the fact that this is included, I think, is important. It's included by Yan, and I don't think he's for this. I think he's certainly not for this, because otherwise it would be conveyed in a very different tone if he were for this. And so this is what I say, bring to the attention of the feminist critics, and we have to debate, is this text too pro-masculine or not? All right, so I also talked about important thing being the pressure put on young people to grow up and be very successful in Chinese culture. And so in this flashback where he loses his finger, we have a passage that addresses that theme. "You know your dad," she asked. He was shot with this gun. This gun was handed down from your grandmother. You're never to touch it. I'm going to hang it on the wall. You're going to look at it every day. And when you look at it, you should think of your father and study hard so you can live a decent life and bring a bit of credit to your ancestors. He wasn't sure how well he understood his mom's words, but he carried on nodding energetically. And so we see here, live a decent life and bring a bit of credit to your ancestors. We don't know yet that his father killed himself. That's one of the most shocking parts of the text to me, and I feel like made this story very powerful. And so we don't know yet. The mother becomes a much more sympathetic character, again to the point about feminism, once we learn that his father committed suicide. But we don't know it yet, so it seems harsh here. But we have kind of a glimpse, maybe a foreshadowing of it, because we know that his father's life was cut short by this gun, and that's what she's wanting him to achieve. I would say she even seems sympathetic here in that even if her words sound harsh, certainly cutting off his finger is harsh, but she doesn't want him to die the way his dad did, and so that's why she goes to the extreme of cutting off his finger. But she's wanting him to live a long life and succeed and be happy. So there's dual things going on. There's the pressure for success in Chinese culture, but then there's also just a mother caring for her son. And even more beyond that comes out of this passage. Ancestors. That's that connection to the past that is always a part of this kind of story. Repetition. You are to look at it every day. Why look at it every day? That's the repression, right? Looking at it but not being able to use it. But the repetition is often happens and is often a subject of psychoanalytical studies of literature. And so that's very important. It's going to have a psychological effect on him. That's not what his parents intend. It's the opposite of it, but it has that effect. Psychology shows us that. What is it supposed to remind him of? Well, we know later it's the suicide, but they're both his parents are pushing it so hard. There might be even more to that, and at this point we don't yet know. So that's kind of how the text is drawing us in and building as there's an unfolding where there's a lot buried beneath the surface here. It's a very psychological text in that sense, and so as we're drawn further into the narrative, as we learn more about the past, more becomes uncovered, and that's one of the end ways of showing us the past is important. And then there's a quote just before this that's really important I wanted to include. Your dad's died. When you die, you can never come back to life. Do you realize that? So I think about my own kids here because I have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, etc. And so how would I explain death to them? They're aware of death. The 3 oldest ones that I just mentioned are aware of death and understand it some, but do they understand you can never come back? She's trying to drive this point home to her 6-year-old son. And so what this tells us is ultimately this is a text that, say, for instance, like Garcia Marquez's Death Constant Beyond Love, this text really meditates on death, what it means, its significance. So there's some bold and powerful themes here the more we unfold and unpack the layers of this complex and dense story. Also, it says, as he's looking at the gun but never able to use it, just a little bit farther down, he was always aware of the spirit of the gun. So it's personified here again, like when it's a snake, it's a living thing. And so that's, again, really significant. Now, another theme I talked about was that innate desire to kill something that many people have, we cannot explain away easily, and is ubiquitous enough. I think we can argue that for many it's a part of their innate nature, and so it certainly is for this protagonist. As he thought of all these things, and that's an important phrase because I didn't want the quote to be too long, but just before this it's describing his missing finger again. And so as he thought of all these things being the missing finger, but it's plural, even though the sentence before this was just describing one thing. So what we have, as I said a minute ago, is like one thing, you pull on that thread, all of this stuff that's buried in the past comes to the surface. So the finger is a wound. There are other texts that use a similar concept. A wound is such a powerful thing. When you call something not just an injury, but a wound, that means there's much more to it. And so the history of his father, his grandfather, it all kind of comes pouring forth as he thinks about this wound. But as he's thinking about all of that, he became filled with hatred for this flock of ducks with their fine feathers. Excuse me, I'm going to kill you. Kill the lot of you if it's the last thing I do. Then I'll eat you, chew your bones to a pulp, and swallow them down. He imagined how crispy and aromatic their bones must be. He stretched his middle finger into the trigger guard. So as we go, he goes from just the language of the story goes from just describing wanting to kill these ducks to really wanting to kill them to eating their bones. The language goes from being kind of vague to being much more graphic, very intentionally on Yan's part. And so as we go deeper into the text, his desire to kill becomes more vivid and the depiction of it. And that's really important to understanding the final scene. So keep that in the back of your mind. All right, I've pulled a lot of quotes from this story. I could have pulled probably a dozen more, but some of them would have been, as great as the language is, just to cover important plot points, because there's a lot happening in this fairly short story. So I'm just going to kind of list some important plot points here without giving you the full quotes to move us along toward our conclusion. So his father represents empowered masculinity when he fights with the officer. The officer is a representative of, Mao's China. He works for the government. And his father takes this guy out, lays him out pretty nicely. So that's like a scene of masculine empowerment. So his father is like a hero, someone he looks up to. Dare I say, a legend? But then his father commits suicide. So this would seem to be an emasculating thing. And I think this is one of the parts of the text that I would assume is probably shocking to us as Western readers, because suicide does not seem like a powerful thing. But in the history of Mao's China, people considered it a form of political protest. As a Western reader, I really struggle with this. I think, is there any ideal I would have where I would take my own life and see that action as more important than being around to help care for and support my family? And I can't. But that's part of the limit of our ability, our cognitive mapping to fully understand another culture. What's interesting is the narrative voice when he tells the flashback of his father, because it continues to call the character dad. And so throughout this whole text, we have a third person, fairly objective narrator in a realist style. And we never have first person. The text never says I. But when he's talking about his dad, I think this is the boy's voice, because he's not present for those events, so he could tell them without saying I. And so he just says dad. And so it's kind of a really clever, interesting narrative technique on the part of Yan, where we're able to slip into the boy's voice without it ever being truly first-person narration. Because the same objective third-person narrator who's describing the events with the ducks would not call that character dad. And so it's one of those kind of slight, clever things Yan does, where it's not fully stream of consciousness. It's not fully free and direct discourse. It's not fully magic realism, but it's pretty close. And I think it could be those things if Yan wanted it to. So he's kind of skirting all these boundaries, but it really takes us deeper into the boy's thoughts and gives us some insight here through a very clever narrative technique. And then one of the most powerful moments for me is when the dad goes off to kill himself, and he says to the mom, don't ever let the boy touch the gun. Because reading the context, I think, is helpful as it can be, also kind of forces us to read the text a certain way. And I was expecting this to be such a hyper-masculine text, and in many ways it is. But when I first saw the mom cut the boy's finger off, I was like, oh, this is not a flattering portrayal of women. But then the more I read it, the further I got, the more sympathy I felt for the mother. This man removes himself from the family, and even if it's a form of acceptable political protest in Mao's China, the mom is saying, no, don't do this. Don't leave us. She's saying no, but if you read between the lines, I think she's saying, don't leave us behind. And so, when she earlier says to the boy, never touch this gun, it feels emasculating, it feels repressive. She cuts his finger off. But then we realize her husband killed himself, and she doesn't want a boy to also pull the trigger. What's the best way to prevent that? Practically speaking, remove his finger. And then the order never to touch it comes from the father, relayed through the mother, not from the mother, just relayed through her. And he could have given us this all up front. Yan could have started with this or had it earlier if he was going to put things in a normal chronological order. But a normal chronological order, typical of traditional realism, will not be this extreme kind of realism that's necessary for this kind of text. And so instead of knowing this information earlier on, we get it later. We're uncovering the psychology as we go. As the boy is having this experience of hunting these ducks, we go deeper and deeper into his psychology, deeper and deeper into the past, and learn more. And eventually the mother moves from being this kind of, character that we don't have much sympathy for to being, I would argue here, an incredibly sympathetic character, because dad is the one who gives the order for the boy not to touch the gun. And later in the third flashback about the grandpa, the boy comes up to look at the gun and the dad says, "Get the hell out of here." The dad is the one who does not want the boy around the gun, not the mom. She's just carrying out what he asked her to do. And so this story really, the perspective really flips more as we uncover the psychology and as we go. And as we're covering these plot points, I have to just say his grandpa is an absolute scoundrel. Like the least sympathetic character in the book. We can see why his grandmother killed him, justifiably so. And so we have like an instance of justifiable death, which is interesting to think about as we go. But he doesn't call him grandpa or some kind of affectionate name the way he calls his father dad in the second flashback. And so I think we see he obviously is much closer to his father. And so this is a generational story. It's about ancestors. It's about reaching back into the past. And what do we see as we reach back into the past? Two ancestors, a father and a grandfather, a father who we should perhaps emulate to a certain extent, but not completely, emulate in various ways. And then a grandfather we should not emulate at all. So it's showing us that the present is flawed, but the past is not perfect. We can reach back and pull elements of the past forward, but certainly not all of them. Sound like anything we've read recently, like maybe Silco? All right. So what do we learn from this? I'm going to do something here that runs a risk, but why not be bold and risky in the last lecture? And I'm going to take a very American idea and map it onto a Chinese text, but I'm going to try to justify that idea first. In justifying it, like I said before, I want to try to return to our guiding themes for the class. So when we talked about cognitive mapping and the reality effect, and I said that true literary realism is taking a humble position and admitting that we cannot fully understand the text and the culture from which it comes. And the real defeats our desires, slays our assumptions. I said that what that means is we should ask a minimum of two questions, but the two most important questions when we read text from a culture that is not our own culture. One is, what is specific, local, unique, new, strange, or, as the cognitive mapping effect says, shocking? And so what do we see here that gives us insight to China? Well, certainly suicide is political protest. There's almost no conditions in the Western world under which suicide would be considered an acceptable thing. But for other cultures, it is. And so that's definitely something that would be new or strange or shocking to me. And then the binding of women's feet is something I've known about for a long time, and it's unique to Chinese culture. Certainly other types of oppressive things happen in the same kind of way. For instance, in the Victorian period in England, pregnant women were forced to wear corsets, which is horrible. So similar things happen, but the specific focus on the feet is kind of specific to Chinese culture. So on the one hand, there's these things that illustrate our capacity to not know the world in its entirety. But on the other hand, these are the great works of world literature. They've stood out above other works for a good reason. And that's because they speak to the universal human condition. So as humans, there are certain things we all experience and feel. And a great story is one that can teach us something about the human condition. So we learn about the local setting, and that's a good thing. But what about the setting transcends that setting, is universal and speaks to the human condition. I would argue, in this case, it's the human impetus for myth-making. This story is one that reaches into the past, and his father is arguably a legend. So this story is very much a story about legends and myths, and about the importance of the individual to create legends and myths. And so this is where, to understand this universal theme, I'm going to map an American concept onto a Chinese one, onto a Chinese text. But I would say my explanation of the philosophy for the class is that certain things are universal. And even though this idea I'm about to discuss happened in a specific American context, I would argue that civilizations and cultures all throughout the world, all over history, have done this thing I'm going to talk about. And so I'm not trying to pigeonhole this text into an idea that doesn't make sense. And the last thing I would add is a concept I've discussed briefly, I'd like to discuss in just a little bit more detail here, which is Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces. It's a wonderful book you should read if you haven't read it. But Campbell argues that all cultures all throughout the world have certain things in common. Now, we shouldn't assume we can understand any culture in its totality, but we are humans. And reading literature teaches about what it means to be human. So great literature should be able to teach us things about all of the cultures throughout all of the world that we have in common. Not everything, but some things we have in common. That's Campbell's argument, and I think it lends credence to my idea of using this particular concept to try to understand the old gun. So there's my justification, my rationale. Let's talk about the concept. It's called regeneration through violence. And so a man named Richard Slotkin wrote a book, which is also a wonderful book you should read, called Regeneration Through Violence. And he makes an argument about there of how American culture has come to be the way it is today. And this is what he says. He says, through myths, the psychology and worldview of our cultural ancestors are transmitted to modern descendants in such a way and with such power that our perception of contemporary reality and our ability to function in the world are directly, often tragically affected. That's a brilliant statement if I've ever read one. What our ancestors do transmits certain beliefs to us that put limitations on how we live. And he talks about specific things American founding fathers did that have formed a specific American ideology. But this quote here applies to people everywhere in general. And then the other quote to explain his idea is, the first colonists in America saw an opportunity to regenerate their fortunes, their spirits, and the power of their church and nation. But the means to that regeneration ultimately became the means of violence, and the myth of regeneration through violence became the structuring metaphor of American experience. So, a general idea. Human beings have a tendency to believe in myths and legends of our ancestors. I think that's a basic human impulse all humans share. And we tend to let those myths and legends influence what we do today. That can apply to everyone. Now, Slotkin is arguing that in America, the specific legend or myth that guides Americans, and he's meaning the U.S. here, is one that we can regenerate. We can create new things that help us through violence. And he's talking specifically about the colonization of the American West here. So that's where the first quote is general, the second one is specific. And so the risk I run is applying the second one to a Chinese text. But this text arguably deals with violence. And I would say most nations have bloody past. So American violence in the U.S. happened in a certain way at a certain time for certain purposes. But pretty much every country, every culture throughout the world has a history of violence. So I think there are aspects of the second idea, though it's more specific, that we can still apply to all cultures. And I want to throw out another term here that should be helpful, which is atavistic, which means relating to or characterized by reversion to something ancient or ancestral. Now, I think the term atavistic, at least, is certainly applicable to the old gun, because this literary movement, the root-seeking movement in 1980s China, wanted to reach back into the past and pull not all, but certain ideas forward to help give China a new identity going into the 21st century. And so there's certainly an atavistic impulse there to a degree. But this text and many texts of the root-seeking movement focus specifically on violence. So that's where I think Slotkin's ideas become useful. That root-seeking movement, the word roots there was the reference to the past, but the impetus of the movement was to create, from drawing on the past, a new identity. So the term regeneration is incredibly applicable to this text and to the root-seeking movement in 1980s Chinese literature, because reaching into the past to create something new is the very definition of the term regeneration. Not generation, regeneration. That's why the past is part of it. And this text certainly has violence. So let's divorce Slotkin's concept from the specific American West identity for a minute and just focus on it more generally as regeneration through violence. How does it apply to this text? Well, there's myth-making, which is what Slotkin argues, right? That the Americans, through this regeneration through violence, made a myth up that still predominates today. So in The Old Gun, the narrator says his dad's story had been so widely repeated that it had already taken on the status of a legend among the villagers. So the villagers, where our protagonist is from, made his dad's story into a legend or a myth. So they did exactly what Slotkin argues. They created a myth, and it is one based on violence. His dad beats up a guy and then kills himself, both as a form of political protest, and those events become legendary. Why? It's similar to In Camera. It's a resistance to the totalitarian, oppressive government that dehumanizes its citizens. That's why he's a local hero of legend. And so what is the narrator trying to do? He's trying to forge a new identity by drawing on his dad's identity, and both involve violence. So there's a certain element of regeneration through violence here. Not quite the same one that happens in America, but the general aspects of the idea are applicable, and I think it helps us to understand what the narrator is doing. I know it's a complex idea. I know my bullet points aren't succinct, but hopefully it's clear, because we have to address one more slide before we leave this story and leave this class. We have the idea now. The character is trying to create a new identity by drawing on the past, and both the new identity and the past one are intertwined with violence and death. So that's what's going on. But we're only partway there. When you're writing literary analysis and you're making a thesis, you can't just have the idea. I've given us an idea here. You have to take the author's stance on the idea. Is he supporting this idea, or is he critiquing this idea? The last passage really begs that question. Here's the final paragraph of the story. The low rumbling explosion. He hasn't been able to fire the gun. He's so frustrated he can't fire the gun. He's kind of walking away with it and has it pointed downward, and he pulls the trigger. And so, of course, in a great moment of irony, it goes off then. And the low rumbling explosion rolled in waves across the autumnal fields, and a ball of red light lit up the water flats and the wild ducks. Shreds of iron and shards of wood hurtled through the air. The ducks took off in startled flight. He toppled slowly to the ground, trying with all his strength to open his eyes. He seemed to see the ducks floating down around him, like rocks falling onto his body, piling up into a great mound, pressing down on him so that it became difficult to breathe. What an ending. A man is covered in ducks. Does he die? It should say protagonist, not narrator there. Do the ducks eat him? Does the hunter become the hunted? Or, this is a Chinese text, right? What's the other one we read? Wasn't it all about cannibalism? Does the meat eater, I love this, get eaten? This guy who has been fantasizing about, dripping duck fat and has just this impulse to kill is now covered in ducks to a point where we can probably assume he, at the minimum, drowns. But it's intentionally ambiguous. We don't even know if he dies or not. Maybe it goes so far the other direction that they don't just drown him or choke him, they eat him. It's an idea to consider. But if this is the final scene, is Yan not pulling the rug out from under everything he said before this? And if he's not pulling the rug out from everything he said before this, then does that not mean the text is really excessively masculine, or is the opposite of being excessively masculine? And what does it really say about killing and death? I said it meditates on death. Is violence a good thing or not? Can regeneration actually happen through violence? Well, it does in America, according to Slotkin, but that's not necessarily a good thing. So we have to ask, can it even happen here? Is it even a good thing here? And finally, does Yan actually undermine the very ideas that scholars consider integral to the literary movement he helped found? I don't know. I'd love for you to answer this. You have my theory of the idea the text puts forth, but you don't yet have my thesis. My thesis would go the next step and say he either supports this idea and believes in it, or he critiques it, the idea he presents. And I haven't answered that question. I'm leaving it up to you. So feel free to explore it or go a completely another direction. I'll end with this. One of my favorite novels, it's an American novel, Mystic River by Dennis Lehane, has this character who achieves kind of a mythological status by the end of it. And he does so through violence. And he very much represents the American dream. He's an ex-convict who reforms himself, creates a successful business, and by the end of it is creating kind of an empire. He essentially pulls himself up by his bootstraps to create this. So he's the vision of the American dream. But what he does at the end of it, he kills someone, and it's not the right person. He's not killing the person he thinks he's killing. And so the policeman, who's his childhood friend, says he's going to bring him down because he took vengeance and operated outside the justice system. And so I think that's a novel that actually supports the U.S. justice system and is critiquing the idea of the American dream. And so I'm asking here, I'm using that as an analogy, and I'm asking here, does Yan critique the very movement he helped found? And I think great literature has the potential to be self-reflexive in that way. So I hope you've enjoyed this class anywhere near as much as I have. I've said that before. I really believe it. But I hope at least you've learned a lot about some cultures around the world through their wonderful literature, and that you now know the questions to ask to understand those texts to the extent we can understand them, but to grow from them. To not understand cultures in their totality, but to grow as a reader, as a writer, and as a person from understanding them to a degree. And, hopefully with my analysis, I know it was a little bit lengthy this time of this last text, you've seen how to ask the right questions.